spite of the fact that social inequalities have continued to increase since the end of apartheid. A troubling fact of the story, however, and this will be of interest to John Scott, is that the whole conception of the prevention of mother-to-child transmission and its justification, at least initially, by the Treatment Action Campaign, were based on the idea of saving babies and never of treating women, with the untold consequence that not only antiretroviral therapies for women were not included in the initial regimens, but that single-dose nevirapine had for implication that later treatment of mothers became extremely problematic because of induced viral resistance. Saving babies went not only with neglecting women, but sometimes with condemning them to treatment failure. In other words, right to life was not claimed with equal energy for all. This South African story may serve as a parable for a more general trend in contemporary societies. In the often quoted last chapter of The Will to Know, Michel Foucault asserts that modernity is characterized by the shift from sovereign power, that is the power to kill, to biopower, that is the power to make live, by which he means the power to measure, regulate, and normalize life. Quote, modern man, he writes, is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being into question, end quote. My theoretical proposition is that contemporary societies are certainly governed by the logics of biopower, the power over life, but perhaps even more decisively by the logics of biolegitimacy, the legitimacy of life as the supreme good. In his critique of violence, Walter Benjamin advocatiously acknowledged this evolution, interpreting, quote, the sanctity of life, that is for him the mere fact of being alive, as, quote again, a recent dogma for which he called for more inquiry. It is likely that the killing fields of the two world wars, the memory of the totalitarian regimes, the trace of 20th century massacres and genocides have contributed to this advent of life as the ultimate human right. It is also probable that the genealogy of this transformation involves more profound anthropological changes in the relation to the sacred, the moral investment in the value of life, replacing a certain loss of religious transcendence. But whatever our understanding of the phenomenon is, one cannot deny the force of the right to life in contemporary societies. It has become so self-evident that not only killing others, even under the harshest conditions of oppression, but is considered absolutely unjustified, but also killing oneself, even as a sacrifice to a superior cause, is seen as an incomprehensible moral scandal. By referring to the killings of others and of oneself, I obviously imply that this principle of biolegitimacy is not shared by all societies, some considering individual or collective rights to dignity or freedom or sovereignty as superior. It is indeed one of the major ethical conflicts in our world. The right to life as a supreme good is both historically constituted and culturally circumscribed. It has not always existed, and it does not exist everywhere. But do not misinterpret me. I'm not defending moral relativism. I even consider that biolegitimacy as a specific historical legitimacy in countries like South Africa or Colombia, which have inscribed the right to life in their new constitutions after decades when the value of life of the majority was so profoundly denied because of racial apartheid and civil war, respectively. So my point is not to contest, obviously, the right to life, but to scrutinize its contradictions and implications. Contradictions are of two kinds, internal and external. Internal contradiction, the right to life does not consider all kinds of life equally. And for instance, individuals or states who consider abortion to be the intolerable murder of a living being frequently do not see any problem in the death penalty for people who are convicted of crimes. An external contradiction. The right to life is not implemented equally for all, and for example, when NATO bombings occurred over Kosovo to protect the Albanian-speaking population, the decision to have planes fly at a high altitude to avoid the Serb anti-aircraft defense had for consequence the inadvertent killing of about 500 Kosovar civilians. The zero-death doctrine, on the one side, had for corollary the collateral damage theory for the other one. But the valorization of the right to life is not just confronted to its contradiction, it also has implications. First, it often obliterates competing rights, particularly the social and economic rights. Thus, moral and political mobilization in favor of a child threatened by a severe disease or of a hostage kidnapped by a guerrilla is much more consensual and effective than around health disparities, which are translated into a difference of 9 years of life expectancy between unqualified workers and university professors in France, or in the United States, into the fact that the loss of life from income inequality is comparable to the combined loss of life from lung cancer, diabetes, motor vehicle crashes, HIV infection, suicide, and homicide. Neither in France nor in the United States are these facts a source of moral indignation. Second, the exclusiveness of the right to life disqualifies the claims of others when they defend other values as their priority. Activists in the streets of Tehran or in the square of Tiananmen, oppressed people in Kurdistan or Palestine may consider freedom or sovereignty a higher value than lives, as did French resistance fighters during World War II or the American colonists combating for their independence at the end of the 18th century. So to conclude and to return to my inaugural South African scene, there is no theoretical reason to oppose the right to life of the child, but also of the mother, and the right to justice, and not mere subsistence. It just happens that in South Africa, as in many other contexts, not only are they frequently defended as mutually exclusive, but also the right to life has become a way of dismissing, or at least forgetting, social and economic rights. And this is what social science is about, accounting for things not as they should be, but as they are. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marconi. At a certain point in his masterful lecture, Jonathan muttered, "I can give you 2,000 examples of that. I don't
remember what was that about, but knowing how erudite Jonathan is, I believed him. I was raised among philosophers, and as John Austin said about them, when philosophers say that they have many examples, they mean that they have one. And when they say that they have infinite number of examples, they mean exactly two. And yet, in crucial moment, Jonathan, with all his generous and expensive mood yesterday, was give us very strict diet of examples of human rights. Mainly all his radical saints who were marshalling talked about equality, about all the noble ideals, but concrete rights weren't really there apart from freedom of expression. And I think that there is a problem here, and let me say what is the problem. The problem is that the talk about human rights vacillate between two notions of human rights. One is human rights as synonymous with global justice, or with natural reasoned justice, a just order. I call it the fat notion of human rights. The lean notion of human rights is minimal, is a threshold requirement to be a legitimate society or a legitimate state. And the main practice of human rights in recent years leans towards the lean notion of human rights, rather than what I suspect was the noble goal of the radical philosopher who actually talked about a moral order based on reason. So, when we try to assess a fruit tree, we usually inspect the fruits rather than expose the roots. And the point is whether human rights are fruit-like, fruit trees, whether we should inspect the actual practice of human rights as it is currently perceived and talked about, or whether we should expose the roots. And I think that Jonathan convinced me yesterday that there is a great merit in exposing these local roots. The great merit is that part of exposing the roots provide us with the main traditional reason for human rights, namely human nature, as an argument for human rights. In Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Devils, the Demons or the Possessed, there is this dark prince, Stavrogin, who says that every human being is worthy of an umbrella. And it's a human right to have an umbrella. I maintain that every human being should have an access to clean water, to reasonably clean water, and to reasonable quantity of clean water. Now, how do I know that Stavrogin is wrong? An umbrella is not the basic human right, whereas clean water, although it's not listed on any list, should be a human right. So one way to go to the tradition is to say it's a basic human need to have clean water, whereas umbrella is not. But then, once we look at the actual list of human rights in the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and all the covenants that accompanied it, there are vast numbers of human rights, such as due process human rights, not to be arrested secretly or not having a secret trial, or social rights which weren't actually in the Declaration of Human Rights. There was a compromise between the Russians and the Americans. The Russians pushed for social rights in order to embarrass the Americans. The Americans pushed to individual rights in order to embarrass the Russians, and they agreed to sign both on two different documents. But in any case, all of them are included as human rights. And I can't in the light of me see how they can be justified by an appeal to human nature. I think that the idea is powerful, but most of those human rights evolved, to my mind, after the Second World War, mostly as a reaction to the evils of Nazism. And they addressed various evils without having a coherent view of them. And the success of agreeing on human rights was exactly on giving on the aspiration to find a foundation, a philosophical foundation that underpinning the human rights. Jacques Maritain, a great Catholic philosopher, who was a prime mover in the human rights of 1948, said that the success was that we agreed on the content of the rights without agreeing on anything to do with the justification. We couldn't. And I think that that's the right approach. Human rights is a kit of tools. It's not a theory. They don't have to cohere. You use them against things that people intuitively identify as evil. And I think that the idea of trying to find foundations is a wrong tack. Look at the practice, not at the foundation. Now, one more thing. Religious morality is usually duty-centered morality. Thou shalt not. Secular movements usually start with rights. It's a right-centered moralities. And there is a great deal of sense in it. Rights is what we want to ourselves. Duty is what we want others to have. But this right-centered approach hides a very troubling problem. Honora Anil, a philosopher, called it the dark side of human rights. Dark not in the sense of sinister, the way Stavrokin was, but dark in the sense of dark matter or the dark side of the moon, an unobserved element. And why do I say that something troubling was hiding beyond the talk of human rights? No one spelled out seriously who burdened the obligation to protect the rights. Now, there is one direct agency, namely the state. And Jonathan mentioned, rightly, that there was stress on sovereignty. So states are the agents to look after the human rights of the people under their jurisdiction. But the main problem of human rights today is that we are facing failed states in the sense of states that are unable and incapable, both in terms of resources and power, to look after the human rights of the people under their jurisdiction. Or rotten states, when the states are the main instigator of violating the human rights of the people. And the problem of human rights today is to intervene in the sovereignty of those states. To what an extent we are entitled to intervene, because sovereignty is a major group right, and human rights came together to the world. And yet there is a tremendous tension between these two basic values, defending human rights and freedom group, and defending self-determination and sovereignty. That's the problem, that's the main problem, I think, of our time. And how to avoid using human rights and interference with sovereignty as a disguised form of neocolonialism. That's the real problem. And that's why NGOs are so important. You have to come to deal with human rights, especially in cases of interference with clean hands. And those who have the power to intervene have no clean hands, and those who have clean hands have no power to intervene. That's the story, and that is why it's so difficult. So it's not an harmonious story of all the good things go together, but there are inner tensions, and the main one is between human rights and sovereignty. Thank you.
Professor Israel? Thank you. Well, I'd like to, having perhaps said enough already yesterday afternoon, confine myself during my 10 minutes or so to just commenting briefly on some of the very important issues that have been brought up by the other three. So perhaps I will move in reverse order and start with Abishai's comment. Of course, I agree very much that sovereignty and self-determination are in tension with human rights in certain contexts, and that there are no harmonious stories behind any of the major trends in modern history. Why would one expect that? Surely one wouldn't. Then there's nothing new about this tension. It was a very real tension. I think in the beginning of the revolution that France proclaimed these human rights, immediately said that these human rights not being respected in neighbouring states, there were tensions straight away with states on all sides. And the temptation to intervene could be interpreted in different ways. It could be, and was interpreted by many in the Dutch Republic, for instance, or in the Genevan Republic, as coming to the aid of democrats who had been oppressed and cheated by aristocrats and were now being saved by revolutionary France. Or you could interpret it as a sovereign interference in the rights of another state, which was simply an attempt to extend the power of France. There's no easy solution to this, of course. But what seems to me, and this is perhaps also something I want to extend in my comments to what the other two speakers have said as well, so remarkable about the way the concept of human rights developed before the revolution in 1789 and was then encapsulated in the decrees, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and other decrees of the revolution before the Robespierrist period, is precisely that individual rights are, I think, listed to a much greater extent than you were willing to concede, certainly not just freedom of expression. There were many other fruits in this, and the clear declaration of equality before the law, which is something sensationally new in an 18th century context, and the unity and equality of all races and peoples, which of course was emphatically denied by most philosophers in the 18th century, is a very remarkable development. And the immediate willingness of Condorcet and his allies not only to extend the principles that they were proclaiming to the black populations of the Caribbean and to attack the problem of slavery with renewed impetus, but even the leaders at least to consider that this was something that had to be applied to the case of women as well, seems to be a great turning point in history of the world. But the crucial thing is that it was, and this is why I tried in my lecture yesterday to put so much emphasis on the role of a certain wing of the Enlightenment, of a certain section among the philosophers, that for them this was the system. So it's not just that we're speaking about origins. Of course, I think the role of the Enlightenment is absolutely indispensable to any discussion of the history of human rights if we're looking at origins and background. But what seems to me so interesting in the context of the latter stages of the history of human rights since 1948 is precisely this bringing together of individual rights with the nation, with problems of sovereignty, with problems of violence and peace, and refusing to separate the possibility of individual rights from the political proposition that the duty of society, the duty of the philosophes, the duty of educated opinion, is to prevent the state from preying on the common welfare, on the interests of the majority, by representing or being captured by vested interests. And Abishai put his finger on one of the issues which is very central indeed to the problems and tensions of the world today, the problem of how you prevent governments being captured by vested interests and pursuing policies which are, by every objective measure, negative, damaging to the interests of the majority of the population seems to be equally central and equally difficult problem. So I would
want to focus my remarks mainly on a rejection of the point that Joan attributed quite rightly to this recent book by Sam Moyne, the Last Utopia. Indeed, he likes sharp breaks, and indeed he does separate the history of human rights in the recent era with remarkable emphasis from all that went before and from the Enlightenment. It's not very clear to me that he has any good arguments for this, and not only does the thesis itself seem to be wrong, but it seems to be the source of his inability to see why there wasn't actually a fundamental separation between individual rights and the claim that democratic societies and the reshaping of the state itself is the only way that these rights can be pursued and safeguarded. The two things go together. The proclaiming of the rights and the proclaiming the need for democratic societies, if there's to be any chance of those rights being upheld and maintained, is completely inseparable. And therefore, I can only say how much I agree with what seemed to be the central theme of Didier Fassin's remarks, that contexts change, fashions change, situations are different. In South Africa, the most remarkable drama in recent years since the beginnings of Black Rule. But if you're going to look at the list of rights as a list of rights and leave out the foundation, leave out the philosophical background that lies behind it, and that philosophical background, for precisely this reason, seems to me not only crucial to history, and I'd like to repeat, I don't think you can understand anything about the beginning of the rise of human rights without that philosophical background, but also as something which is still today profoundly topical, because the temptation or a convergence of social pressures that lead to one or two social rights being emphasized in such a way as to unbalance the whole picture and have a negative effect and prejudice other areas of human rights. Of course, this is both inevitable and very much facilitated by simply looking at human rights as a list of things that may or may not be entitled to, detaching this entirely from a political apparatus which was supposed to be inseparable from it in the early stages, and from those social rights that some wanted to include and others didn't in 1948, and from a philosophical framework which I would claim was sporadically, not only sporadically dominant in the late 18th century, but was the only factor that made possible the proclaiming of the rights of man, citizen in the form that it took, and a conception of philosophy which has largely been rejected by the 19th and 20th centuries, but which still has a certain relevance to us today, precisely because it was the frame which made possible this linkage between basic human rights and democracy as the only legitimate representative democracy. There's great emphasis amongst the people I was referring to, representative democracy as against direct democracy, representative democracy as the only political and social frame which can pursue and uphold this influence. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. You've given us all a lot to think about, and we'll return to that conversation roughly 20 or 25 minutes from now, so I'd like to invite you all to join us in Full Hall for some coffee or tea, and then reassemble back here in approximately 25 minutes. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we want to get this part of our session started. I want to thank the panelists for a very intriguing set of comments. Not only that, but I didn't have to remind any one of the panelists about the time at all during this whole procedure, but we had a lot to think about between abstract individual rights, substantive rights, land rights, within rights, life versus justice, and so on. And who's going to protect these rights anyway? Well, the state's going to protect them. On the other hand, the state's a problem